Hey everyone, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Ashveil, a DPS with great damage amping utility and devastating follow-ups that deal massive damage. I'll be discussing his kit, builds, Lightcones, and possible teams. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information shown is from the Creator Experience server, so things could still change when his banner drops. Let's first start with his basics, which is your regular basic attack that deals damage. Nothing really too special, I just wanted to showcase the animation since you'll never really use it due to his skill. Now speaking of which, for his skill, it's the ability you'll end up spamming during his turns, and it does a couple of neat things. First of all, it deals a lot of single target damage, then marks its target as bait. And whenever Ashveil hits the bait with a skill again, not only does it deal more damage, it also restores 1 SP, completely refunding its SP cost. Meaning, aside from the SP used to mark an enemy as bait, Ashveil is completely SP neutral and friendly, which is neat if you plan to run him in SP hungry teams. Now, as long as an enemy with bait is on field, every enemy gets hit with a 40% death shred, which is neat for damage since it's pretty much permanent, cause Ashveil reapplies bait to the enemy with the lowest HP if ever the current bait dies or leaves the field. But moving on to his talent, which is his follow-up attack, and it's where a lot of his damage comes from since he is a follow-up DPS after all. Now Ashveil starts the battle with 2 charges, which can stack up to 3 and are required to launch his follow-up attacks. And whenever an ally hits the bait, Ashveil regens a fixed 8 energy. Then, if he has charge, he consumes 1 stack of it to launch a single target follow-up attack against the bait, while subsequently gaining 2 stacks of gluttony that can stack up to 12, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, the only way to gain charge is with his ult. But speaking of which, aside from looking cool, his ult also does a couple of things. First, it deals a lot of single target damage and marks its target as bait, after which it generates 3 of his charges and launches a special enhanced follow-up attack. Now this enhanced follow-up does not consume charge points, but instead, it consumes his gluttony stacks, with every 4 points of gluttony consumed, dealing 1 additional instance of damage for up to 3 additional hits for a total of 4 when counting his enhanced follow-up's initial hit. And finally, if the bait dies before all the hits are used up, it deals the remaining damage instance to the next bait, which gives him some AoE capabilities despite him being single target focused. But if all enemies happen to die before then, the follow-up immediately ends without dealing all additional damage instances. Just note, his gluttony is not consumed all at once, but instead, it consumes 4 at a time before he deals an additional hit with his enhanced follow-up. So the first hit will benefit the most from his A4 passive's damage buff, while the last benefits the least due to there being less gluttony stacks active upon using it. Speaking of his A4 passive, it permanently increases the damage of his follow-ups by 80%, and for every stack of gluttony he currently has, his follow-ups deal an additional 10% damage per stack for a max of 120%. So in total for follow-up units, this can give up to a 120% crit damage buff, which is neat for his personal or team damage in a hyper carry or duo DPS team. Now aside from follow-ups, the way you stack gluttony is with his A2 passive, which gives him 1 stack by using his skill and 2 from using his ult. And whenever his follow-up kills an enemy, it also gives 1 stack of gluttony. The neat thing is, thanks to this, you only need a max of 10 bait stacks before using his ult to get all of his enhanced follow-ups additional hits. As for his A6 passive, it gives 2 permanent buffs as long as Ashveil is on field. The first is a permanent 40% team-wide crit damage buff, while the second is an 80% team-wide crit damage buff for any follow-up attacks. So in total for follow-up units, this can give up to a 120% crit damage buff, which is neat for his personal and team damage even in duo DPS follow-up teams. And finally for his technique, it dazes enemies in the overworld, causing them not to attack you. While in battle, it just deals an AoE to all enemies while giving Ashveil 1 charge, allowing him to start combat with 3 charges. But for ability prio, level up his skill first to maximize his defense shred, then his talent and ult, then you can just ignore his basics. Now his talent and ult is interchangeable with his skill depending on how much your team would value his defense shred. But with this kid out of the way, let's talk about his Eidolons. His E1 increases the damage taken by all enemies by 24% as long as he's on field, And for enemies with 50% or lower HP, this damage vulnerability increases to 36% instead, which of course is neat for damage. Fun fact, with this E1, Ashveil becomes very similar to an S1 E0 Cypher in terms of debuff utility, with him providing a higher defense shred but lower damage vulnerability. But if you do get his S1 alongside his E1, you will end up providing bigger debuffs than an S1 Cypher, unless of course you have her E2, but overall, it's a pretty insane Eidolon for increasing your team damage output. While his E2, it increases the max stack of his Gluttony to 18, and whenever his ult triggers his enhanced follow-up, it refunds 35% of the Gluttony stacks it consumed. With the max stack increase, Ashveil can now get a max 260% damage buff for his follow-ups and a max of 4 additional hits for his enhanced follow-ups. As for his E4, it allows his ult to give a 40% attack buff for 3 turns, which is pretty neat. And finally, his E6, it reduces every enemy's ult type rest by 20% as long as there's a bait on the field, meaning it's pretty much permanent. Aside from this, Ashveil gains a 4% damage buff for every Gluttony stack he gained throughout the battle, stacking up to 30 times for a total of a 120% damage buff. This again is just more Ashveil damage, plain and simple. But with his Eidolons out of the way, let's talk about his possible light cones. Ashveil's really cool looking signature gives him an 18% crit rate buff just by equipping it. Aside from this, it gives him the Umbra Devourer buff for 3 turns for every 4 follow-ups he procs. And when he has the Umbra Devourer buff, it increases his attack by 40%, while increasing the damage taken by all enemies by 20%. Overall, it's a pretty simple yet great high buff uptime option for boosting his and his teammates' overall damage. Now as a hunt unit, he does have quite a few alternatives. For his best free-to-play option, it's of course the Hurt to Shop Cone for lots of crit rate and attack. But just note, you do have to consistently kill enemies for good uptime on its attack buff, which Ashveil wants to be doing anyway for his Gluttony stacks. As for premium 5-star options, Worrisome Blissful is great for its bonus crit rate, crit damage, and high damage buff for his follow-up attack. Dr. Ratio's signature is also great for lots of crit damage, damage buffs, and a huge def ignore for his follow-ups. But just note this cone is best used with other debuffers, and you can end up overcapping on defense reduction depending on your team if you're not careful. Another possible option is Archer's signature for a lot of crit rate and a lot of attack, which Ashveil really wants due to the lack of attack buffs in his kit. However, sadly, you need Sparkle in the team to get its full attack buff due to its 6 SP requirement. As for 4-star options, See You at the end is a great crit damage and follow-up damage stat stick. But sadly, it's a paid BP cone, so it's expensive and takes a while to get copies of. Plus, like I said, he already gets lots of crit damage. Only Silence Remains is great for loss of attack and crit rate when there are 2 or less enemies. And finally, Swordplay is really good for a huge damage buff, but it requires you to hard focus one enemy. But with his light cones out of the way, let's look at possible relics. Now for Cavern Relics, his best one is Grand Duke for its huge follow-up damage and attack buff. But for other sets, Pioneer can work too since Ashveil's bait does count as a debuff. However, you need to run other debuffers to get the full effect of the set, and sadly, he does get a lot of crit damage already, so it's very easy to oversaturate his buffs. Now the Eagle set can work too, mainly for duo DPS teams, to maximize his energy gains with more turns to help him spam more follow-ups. And it does have some synergy with an ER rope, but I wouldn't recommend running this set in other team comps. And as usual, you also have the option of using a 2-piece combo of any crit or attack set if you don't have good pieces of any of the sets I just mentioned. As for planar sets, he has quite a bit of options as well. You can use the new Converging Stars set, which gives him some attack while providing the party with a crit damage buff. But because it's new, Duran is also great for more follow-up and crit damage, but it needs another follow-up unit to stack its passive pretty quickly at the start of combat. However, again, it's very easy to oversaturate its follow-up and crit damage buff with Ashveil. Salsoto, as usual, is a decent option for more crit rate and follow-up damage, but it gives smaller buffs compared to Duran and Converging Stars. And finally, for a duo DPS team with 2 hunt characters, Izumo can work too for more crit rate and attack. But with his possible relics out of the way, let's talk about stats. Now, he has a high base attack of 776 and a decent base speed of 106. But aside from this, his traces also gives him 14% lightning damage, 10% attack, and 37% crit damage. And in total, he can get 157% crit damage from his kit alone. Granted, 87% of that is only for follow-ups, so make sure to consider all of that when building. For main stats, a crit rate chest is preferred since he already has a lot of crit damage sources and it makes it easier to get to 100% crit rate. While either speed or attack boots can work, with speed boots putting him at 131 speed, allowing you to get 134 speed easily, letting you focus on other offensive stats. But attack does allow for more damage, so honestly it's up to your team and substat luck. As to the rope, an attack rope is of course pretty good and the preferred option. But an energy rope can work for more follow-ups through more frequent ults by maximizing the energy gain from his skill. But just note, an energy rope does not affect the energy you gain from his talent. So I only recommend it for teams with a lot of attack buffs like some Sparkle teams, or if you're not running an energy support and are having trouble getting his ult, or for some setups with duo DPS follow-up teams with the Eagle set. In other cases, it may cause a damage loss, making it not worth it over losing the offensive utility from an attack rope. Cause usually having fast attacking units or energy supports is enough to get his ult back consistently. However, if you really want to run an energy rope, depending on your team, I recommend running an attack orb if the attack loss is too big even after buffs. But speaking of which, for the orb, either attack or electric damage can work, and which one you'll use really depends on your current setup. If your Ashveil already has a ton of damage percent buffs like in Sunday teams, just use an attack orb. While for general use, or if using multiple attack main stats or running him in teams with lots of attack buffs like Sparkle teams, use an electric orb. But for stat goals starting with speed, he has 3 possible options. The first is 134, which is good for a duo DPS team where you won't always be running a speed-tuned action advancer, namely facial comps where maximizing actions is important, or for teams where Ashveil's teammates have trouble building his ult on their own, so his own turns matter more. The next is speed tuning for a -1 speed action advancer like Sunday, which we all know is 135 speed. And finally, you can go base speed if you're running him with a 160 speed Sparkle or in a team filled with extremely high attack frequency units that can fully take care of building his ult for him. As for crit damage, as I mentioned earlier, he gains 157 crit damage from his kit alone. So I recommend going around 120 or more crit damage just to ensure his skill and ult still do good damage. But he does have a lot of crit damage sources, so depending on your team and setup, you can honestly get away with less. As for crit rate, try to get as close to 100% crit rate as you can to properly take advantage of his inherently high crit damage stat. Just make sure to prioritize this above all else since he doesn't have many sources of crit rate. And finally for attack, I recommend around 2,800 to 3,500 or more attack depending on how much attack main stats you have. But of course, more is always welcome, especially for teams that don't have too many attack buffs since Ashveil's kit doesn't give him any. But with his stat breakdown out of the way, let's talk about possible teammates. Ashveil, due to the nature of his kit, can be played either as a main or sub DPS, which is mainly due to his Death Shred and good follow-up buffs, enabling his teams and personal damage. He can be used either in a hyper carry or duo DPS setup, where he is best ran with a follow-up or high attack frequency unit to help him generate energy for his ult, proc his own follow-ups, or simply for more team damage. And as a side note, his support utility is already pretty decent even at E0 S0, and you can even use him as a generic damage amper for other teams due to his Death Shred. But if you decide to get either his S1 or E1, his support utility increases by a lot, which is something you might want to consider if you really want to use him as a generic damage amper. Though with that being said, let's first look at his hyper carry teams, where his best supports are either Sunday, Sparkle, 3B, Cypher, or the RMC. But honestly, pretty much any support can work. Ruan May for rest spends, Tingyun for her attack buffs, and Silver Wolf or Pella for defense shreds. While Robin is also pretty good since Ashveil is of course a follow-up DPS, but she will require a very fast or high attack frequency sustain or second support just to trigger Ashveil's follow-ups consistently. Speaking of sustains, Don Hung is the best mainly for his attack buff and high attack frequency. But units like Wolf Wolf for her attack buff and energy, Hyacinth, Lingsha, or Aventurine for their high attack frequency, and Gallagher just by being the GOAT budget sustain can all work. But with that being said, you must always bring a high attack frequency unit either as your support or sustain. Otherwise, he'll have trouble charging his ult or proccing his follow-ups, especially if you're not running an energy support. Plus, the neat thing is, if you run a team filled with high attack frequency units like Dan Heng, Treeby, Cypher, or the RMC, Ashveil can fully rely on them to charge his ult. It's also worth noting that if you're using Sparkle, you might want to consider using a damage percent orb and maybe an ER rope, since she already gives a huge attack buff and you'll be using attack boots for base speed, which is already too much attack, especially with multiple Loshakas and if you're using Dan Heng and other attack buffers in the team. Now for duo DPS follow-up teams, you can pretty much run him with any follow-up DPS, with Fei Xiao being the best. But units like Jing Yuan, Topaz, and others can work too. Just as a fun fact, when running him with an S1 Fei Xiao, it allows her to get up to a 94% def reduction for her ult due to her signature. Now sadly, aside from Fei Xiao, a lot of these units will still struggle in endgame content even with Ashveil, especially without any vertical investment, since a lot of them are super dated at this point. So hopefully they get a Nova Flare in the future, or Ashveil gets a new follow-up DPS partner, just so we'll have more effective duo DPS follow-up teams for endgame. Sadly, because of this, you can't really consider him the Dahlia of follow-up teams, but it's worth noting that if you give Ashveil some vertical investment, he does allow a lot of them to perform much better in endgame content. But honestly, you can say the same thing about the supports for these teams. Speaking of which, a team-wide buffer like Treeby, Cypher, or Robin is preferred since it is a duo DPS team. Now finally, there is one last very fun team you can try, which is an Ashveil plus Archer team. Now thanks to Ashveil's SP neutrality and Sparkle's buffs, you're able to slot in Ashveil without really having to worry about SP as long as you run another SP positive support or sustain. And the neat thing is, Archer can fully proc all of Ashveil's follow-up on his own due to his skill spam, while also providing 40 energy to Ashveil if you manage to use all 5 Archer skills on the bait. Plus, it's pretty satisfying watching Ashveil's and Archer's follow-ups trigger off each other. However, is it Archer's best current team? Well, not really. But Ashveil is a very viable unit for this comp. Well, it is pretty good at clearing endgame content, and if you do decide to invest in Ashveil's E1 or S1, at the very least, I would consider him to be on par with an S1 Cypher. But Cypher is still a bit more comfy since she generates more SP, plus she front-loads lots of damage, so I still prefer her over Ashveil for the team. It's also worth noting that due to his debuff utility, he can technically slot in other teams as well as a generic damage amper, since pretty much anyone can benefit from his huge defense shred, and this is especially the case if you decide to get his E1 or S1 for some damage vulnerability. But of course, just like Archer teams, he definitely isn't the best support for these teams. He's just more of an alternative if you're missing some units. But that's about it. Personally, as much as I want and like Ashveil, I'll probably have to skip because Silver Wolf is next. I mean, just look at her. She has the Infinity Gauntlet, Camina's Glasses, and the Strike Freedom Swings. How can I not want her? But make sure to tell me what you think about him in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub. Now, onto the showcase. I hope you enjoy, and remember, I suck at this game.